Hello, welcome to the Be Ready for the World conference. I'm Steve from Cambridge University Press and I'll be hosting your webinar today. I'm delighted today to be joined by Sharon Hennam-Dale, who'll take you through the session on teaching for the 21st century. Sharon's worked in education for over 25 years as a head teacher, coach and international school consultant. Before we start, I just want to go through a few points with you. You may have noticed that your microphones are muted. They'll stay on mute as we go through the session to avoid any background noise. Sharon and I are both also hosting this webinar from home. So if there are any issues with our internet connections or other interruptions, please bear with us. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a Q&A session. So please do post any questions you'd like to ask Sharon in the Q&A box as we go through. You can also use the chat box for any general comments you have, but please don't post questions for Sharon here as they may get lost in the chat. If you're having any technical difficulties with sound or video, please let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to resolve them. We recommend that you use headphones to get the most out of this session for the best sound quality. This webinar will be recorded and we'll send you a link to the playlist following the conference, so don't worry if you miss anything. If you're unable to see the Q&A or the chat icons, please hover your mouse at the bottom or top of your screen and they should appear. And now over to Sharon.
Thank you very much, Steve. So a very warm welcome from wherever in the world you're joining us today. I really hope you've enjoyed the last couple of days and I'm delighted to be starting off the final day with you. As this session is live, there's going to be some opportunities for you to be involved using a web-based tool, Mentimeter. So if you've got a phone or a Wi-Fi connection on another device, or you can open another browser window, you'll see that there are some joining instructions on this slide. So pop those into your browser and that will take you to the relevant web page and that will enable you to contribute to our session at key points today. So please do get involved. I'm really interested to see and hear your thoughts on 21st century teaching today. So I'd like to begin with just a brief overview of what we're going to be covering our session today. The issue of what our students need to know and what is 21st century teaching has always received a great deal of attention. But of course, as we know with recent world events, it's been given even more consideration. So the COVID pandemic has affected all of our schools, it's affected all of our education systems, and there's that ongoing impact on the way that we live, the way that we learn and work. So today we're going to consider that pandemic as a driver of change in reflecting and revisiting what 21st century teaching may mean, but also reflect on the opportunities it's presented us with to really think about 21st century skills and to think about what they may look like in the context of teaching and learning. We use that term 21st century skills a lot in our schools across the world, but do we have some real clarity about that, what that actually means for our own schools and for our own learners? And if not, how do we know we're actually applying it and integrating it into our teaching? So the world we know is changing very, very quickly. We talk a lot as teachers and again in education about lifelong learning. And we want to ensure that our students are successful, that they have the best possible life chances. And we know that many of our learners already learn in that global classroom. And that now extends beyond those traditional four walls and beyond our school environment as well. And when we think about 21st century teaching, we often think about how we're going to best facilitate the learning to help our students acquire that knowledge and the skills they need to be present in what we know is a rapidly changing world. Now, a generation ago, we could expect that what we taught students would last a lifetime. But due to the pace of change that we're faced with today, not knowing what the world's going to look like, we don't know what the problems are that are going to arise, the ongoing trends we have around globalization, around technological progress, and around demographic change, they're not likely to slow down in the future. And it's really difficult, isn't it, to plan to reach that destination when at the moment we don't know what it looks like or where it's going to be. And the challenge here is around the realistic extent, isn't it, to which we in schools and in education can actually bridge that gap and can best support our learners to prepare them for the demands of this unknown future, but also what skills they need as they're becoming increasingly complex. So that brings us to the first chance for you to become engaged and involved this morning. Hopefully you'll see this question coming up now on Mentimeter. So we'd really like your input here. And also please do use the chat function as well. When we speak of 21st century skills, what is it that comes to mind from your experience, both within and outside of the classroom? So we'll give you a moment just to hopefully pop some responses in there. We'll see those coming through. Wonderful, thank you. We've got our first few adaptability. Great. Fabulous, thank you so much, all of you. So hopefully you can all see that appearing on the screen. And we're seeing, what we're seeing here is really quite a broad range of skill sets, isn't it, emerging, and those professional attributes also as well. There are some commonalities there, but also we're seeing some quite different ideas. And actually that might be about what's pertinent for your learners more at the moment and what's particularly important for your school right now. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's a great phrase there, moving on, absolutely. Where are they moving to and what does that start to look like? Fantastic, thank you so much for that. And you should hopefully, if you've got the Mentimeter, be able to go back and have a look at that to see some more of those responses as we move through and towards the end of the session also as well. So thinking about 21st century skills, often when we talk about that term, it's used to refer to this sort of overarching concept of the knowledge, the skills and the dispositions that learners need. And these relate not only sometimes to core competencies, but you can see in the slide there in blue, some of those kind of more broader skills around that. And they're the things that advocates believe that we need to teach students in order for them to thrive in today's world. So that brings us to the next few slides where we're going to explore a little bit about what's out there in terms of research and what the literature has done. And a lot of the literature has actually attempted to identify these 21st century competencies and skills and put them into analytical frameworks. And some of those models you may well have come across before. So the first model that we can see here is the 4 C's model. And that's based on the idea that 21st century challenges are going to demand that broad set of skills. And we can see here we've got that creativity, we've got the critical thinking, the communication, and the collaboration as well. And there's also that way of thinking and that idea out there that actually by bringing these 4 parts together for students, we create a much stronger whole as well. But this model, like many others, is continually evolving and in many different ways. And again, that really does illustrate the complexity of defining 21st century skills. For example, we've now got the 5 C's model, and that includes character. And we also have the 3 R's model, and we also have the 3 P's model as well. The second model asked the question, what knowledge is most worth? And this study considered the kinds of knowledge that many researchers state are integral and important for success in the 21st century, and what this actually might mean for teachers and for education. And this, they suggest, determines the what and the who. So the what and how students train and how we prepare our teachers to do that. And from this review, they summarised that there were 9 forms of knowledge and that they could be seen as falling into 3 broad categories. So the 3 broad categories we've got there are the foundational knowledge, and that's that answer to the what question. What is it our students need to know? The meta-knowledge, of course, is about the process of using that foundational knowledge. So it's how we're working with it. And then that 3rd form of knowledge, the humanistic knowledge, is that vision of the learner's self and its location in the broader social and global context. So in our final model, Griffin and Kerr identified and placed 21st century skills into 4 main categories. And they suggest this creates a really manageable set of very practical, demonstratable capabilities. And they also suggest that this model can potentially accommodate any further new or emerging skill sets that might be generated, and particularly those in response to anything contextual, social, economic, or political priorities. So we can see in this model, we've got those personal competencies, which we often talk about as the soft skills, in addition to those other skills that are really primarily of value in a work-based context. And I know certainly given our focus over these 3 days on primary and particularly lower secondary, this broader focus away from careers and work at this stage around some of those other skills are particularly important to us. What we do know from looking at those 3 models on the slides is that defining 21st century skills draws on a huge amount of research, and it contains hundreds of overlapping descriptors of skill sets. Now, there is some consensus between the 3 models that we've looked at today. Indeed, we've seen collaboration come through all of those. We've seen communication, we've seen creativity and the critical thinking. But we also have seen emotional awareness, and we've seen digital competency and digital literacy appear more than once as well. However, despite that consensus, what we do know is that there is no unique and there's no single approach to the definition of 21st century skills. And the danger here is that we start to talk about 21st century skills. It becomes a term that we use quite often in our conversations with one another and in schools throughout the world, but we're actually unable to really clearly define it. So this final slide shows and highlights some of the many things that you'll be very familiar with of emerging education, things around the latest thinking. We have global competency, we have that growth mindset. There's lots of new research into social emotional learning. And in some ways, many of those are related, but they use a different language and they use a different terminology. So if we think about how this slide links to 21st century skills, often the challenge of unpicking these and determining if the skills and attributes that we see here are common, but also linked to some of the frameworks around 21st century skills, often lies with schools. And of course, that combined with the different needs and the focuses that we have in our schools for different types of learners at classroom and at school level, all can make 21st century teaching quite a challenging task. So what we do know that's emerging is that there is still a lack of evidence around literature, around the actual process of integrating those 21st century skills into education. So the question I think for us, particularly as teachers and educators, is in a constantly changing environment, what skills are essential for your learners in able to support them being able to meet the challenges of their everyday and of their future life? As we said, the world is changing very, very quickly. And a bigger question here, which of course we don't have time to go into today, is how is education keeping up with those changes? We know that there are drivers of demand at global level, and they're influencing that need for 21st century skills and education. But we also need to recognise the level of diversity across different regions that we have and across different countries, and to consider the way that some of those contextual, some of those economic circumstances inform those skills, but also those priorities at national levels, and then subsequently what that means for us at our school level as well. So Scott's model here provides us with a really good starting point for having and shaping a discussion around 21st century learning at school level. And as mentioned, we've seen the emergence of a lot of discussion around this new model of learning that's needed. And most of us do accept that education needs to continue to evolve and to be transformed to tackle some of these complex global challenges that we have ahead of us as well. But as we've already identified, currently there's no single prescribed approach on how best to do that in education and in teaching as well. So I think if we step back from that global, we step back from that national picture as well, it's looking at that first point on there and thinking at a school level. What is your school's motivation for looking at a new model of learning? What's driving that currently at the moment? And if we start to think about the competencies and we start to think about the skills needed, what is it we should adopt? And what are the most useful 21st century frameworks and thinking and those analytical frameworks out there, the models that actually may help us do that? And then finally, we then need to think about how that's going to translate into pedagogy. So what we're going to keep and what is it that we're going to use that's going to be different? And what are the implications of that for instructional strategies, and certainly when we're developing and we're teaching the curriculum as well. So some headlines, I'm sure some of you, will have seen very familiar ones wherever you are in the world as well. And of course, One of the motivations for this new model of learning has been the recent pandemic, and that's really tested our resilience, hasn't it, in education? And it's also highlighted and shown those gaps that we have on that technological and digital divide in some instances. So as you can see from this slide, there are a few headlines here, but there are some startling and in a way quite worrying consequences arising from the impact that it's had, the pandemic, on students' learning and outcomes for learners. But it's also served to highlight some of those existing challenges that we have in education, but also some of those inequalities as well. Now, that quick shift to online learning has also raised some further questions, hasn't it? If that's been something that's been a key feature of your practice in the last 12 months. And that's asking us about new models of learning and thinking what a digitally enhanced 21st century reality is going to actually look like, perhaps in the future of education. But also the practices and some of those complications that come with that, such as overcoming those barriers, such as access to technology, teacher skills and confidence in using that, but also the potential impact that that has if we move into hybrid models more of as a permanent thing, or if we look at more of a remote technology approach, the impact that that has on students' mental, emotional and physical well-being as well. So I'm really interested to learn, reflecting on your understanding of 21st century skills, but also reflecting on the challenges that have been caused by the pandemic as well. If you have made that move to that remote context and those kind of new ways of working, those new models of learning, what skills were most valuable to your learners? So again, please do post your responses, and hopefully we'll see those coming through in a moment. Resilience, thank you. Yeah. Leadership. Great. So we can see a lot coming through around, a lot of commonalities around technology, tolerance, we've got resilience, we've got persistence. So already some of those 21st century skills that we've identified. Engagement, yes, and particularly yes, with younger children, that has been a key as well. Digital literacy, key. Okay, thank you for sharing those. So it's been really interesting also to take into consideration what the latest research is telling us about effective teaching in that remote context. And the 2 points on the top of this slide reminds me in particular to think about how we're integrating that technology into our pedagogy. Are we seeing that as an integrated tool or a tool which drives it? And it's that question, isn't it? Are we teaching through the screen or teaching to the screen as well? And what does digital pedagogy actually look like in that question? So we can also see from the research that those ways of working involving communication, and of course that came up in your contributions previously, but also collaboration, and those things that we're seeing in 21st century skill frameworks, they're emerging again as being particularly prominent here. And it's also been really interesting to talk to colleagues such as yourselves in many different parts of the world and to kind of see what your key reflections are that are emerging from this. And again, to consider how that aligns with our thinking around 21st century teaching as well. And again, from this slide, we can see that there's a real emphasis on that collaboration, but again, that communication at different levels and with different stakeholders within a school, but also we can see that development of emotional skills, and they're all emerging as key trends, and again, skills that have been very valuable during the pandemic. And again, moving to this second slide, we've got those opportunities for creativity coming here, and for learners perhaps to demonstrate some of these skills, interestingly, that may not have come to the fore before in a school-based context. And interestingly, we've got some feedback here around levels of independence, organisation, learners' ability to adapt. And I think this again helps us ask the question, doesn't it, to thinking more deeply about learning, you know, in terms of how we've provided those opportunities for learners to perhaps demonstrate that proficiency in 21st century skills more in a way that sometimes we may not have seen in our classrooms. So resilience came up, and many of you commented this on well, and I think what we have seen in many instances is that this is emerging as a key skill, and it's the value of recognizing it as an essential skill almost for our learners. And of course, many of you, I'm sure, have been checking in with your learners to make sure that they've been coping if you've been teaching remotely, but also to ensure that they've had those opportunities to connect to peers and to one another in building that resilience as well. And when we consider those headlines that have been emerging from the research as well earlier, in a lot of instances, our learners are really going to require that resilience to really empower them to overcome some of the adverse effects of the pandemic, but also to continue to improve the development and of other 21st century skills in the longer term. So I think this brings us to a key question here, doesn't it? Are the 21st century skills that we talk about that really that different from the goals that we currently have for teaching and learning and that we currently use? So do many of those competencies and skills that we talk about, such as resilience, do they just seem more modern now? But actually they're not new. They're part of what we do day to day in teaching our students. Have they just become newly important? Or is it that question that we need to specifically identify and focus on some new skills once things are kind of back to normal, because it's become apparent just how essential some particular skills are. So we have a challenge, but we also have a great opportunity. We've been forced really to become a lot more reflective, haven't we, in the last 12 months about how we use pedagogy. And we've had to transform our approach in many instances, but we've also had to reevaluate what we do. So the question is, what is your school readiness to facilitate those 21st century learning practices? Now, are we fully embracing those to really maximize that learning and those experiences for our students as well? Some great questions here from yous, certainly thinking about what happens when we return to that kind of new normal as well, because given where we currently are and the reflections around pedagogy, what does this mean for our future practice when we return or emerge from where we are at the moment, this moment in time? Is that question, are we going to return to teaching as we know it? Are we going to start moving to a different path? So two questions here. Really, the first one thinking around curriculum. And it's that question, if we're returning to teaching that accumulation for many of us of that curriculum content, does that make that inclusion of that deep, that critical and that creative thinking that we talk around in 21st century skills, does that make it more challenging because there's so much to get through? Or are we going to dedicate the time and effort to understand why students disengage to make sure that this is minimised? And within that second area that you asked the question around, are we as teachers going to spend that time away from curriculum coverage or as part of it to continue to support that greater focus on 21st century skills, such as emotional awareness and resilience as well? So again, another opportunity, please, for you to be involved. What positives, thinking about your experiences over the last 12 months, have you learned in your own practice that you would really like to keep in the future? So again, please do post your responses into Mentimeter, and again, we'll see hopefully those coming through in a moment or two. Patience, absolutely. And that's so key, that focus on mental well-being. I think we all identify with that has had such a much more heightened focus in our schools, not only for us as teachers, but also, you know, particularly for us, for our learners. Parent engagement, yeah, as a tool, yeah. Many of us have been doing both roles, haven't we? We've been in that situation where we've been teaching our own children as well as educating others as well. Mindfulness, flexibility, like some fantastic skills coming through there, thank you. And we can see mindfulness is certainly appearing more than once as well on there. Engagement, that interaction between that we have with learners as well, particularly as technology. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Collaborations on there. Yeah, I can see lessons can be observed. That's, yeah, again, it's that how we've been much more exposed, and we've had parents observing our lessons like never before, and you know, perhaps that sharing that we've had with colleagues, you know, that's a great thing to take going forward about how that can support us again and continue to evolve great practice. Thank you for those. So really interesting piece of research to share with you. This is the report from the World Economic Forum, and they published this in October last year, and they've identified their top 10 skills that are going to be needed in the workplace in 2025. And what's really fascinating about this is that the top 2 on here have gone to skills that didn't appear at all on the previous list. We've got analytical thinking, and we've got active learning on there as well. And also at number 5, we've got resilience, which again didn't appear. That's a new skill cluster that's been added to that list. And of course, I suppose we can trace these back to the pandemic as well, but they're really emerging and they're being recognised now much more globally as those key 21st century skills. So we know education, and we mentioned this earlier, isn't just about creating a workforce for the future. It's about the holistic development of our learners, particularly for us in primary and lower secondary, and how our teaching enables learners to use such ways of working and thinking in the 21st century. But I'm going to just take you through exploring and aligning what some of that thinking around those skills that are emerging in a kind of that wider economic forum as being essential to workforce, what that starts to look like for us in teaching and in education as well. So of course we've got analytical thinking. It's that crucial first step that comes before critical thinking. And with these skills, learners, they're able to master any new problems, aren't they, that they encounter both in the classroom but also in the workplace. And interesting, analytical thinking, of course, is that 4th level in Bloom's taxonomy. And many of you already use that. You'll be very familiar with that and that tool for promoting students' higher order thinking skills. And the question here really is, are we reflecting on whether our teaching is placing enough emphasis or opportunity for the development of that analytical thinking as a key cognitive skill? The second one, active learning, of course, is an approach that's really advocated by Cambridge. And of course, we've got a great session coming up later this morning, led by my colleague Fleur, which is focusing on this. It is that process of engaging our learners in teaching in a really active means, allowing them to construct their own understanding, and rather than being those passive recipients of information, of course. It's the key to development really in 21st century skills. It supports autonomy, it supports retention, it supports adaptation and transference of learning. It gives learners a much deeper level of understanding. It makes things more meaningful and related to life experiences. But of course it goes hand in hand as well with those higher order thinking frameworks such as Bloom's taxonomy. Of course, complex problem solving, we all know the value of problem solving within our pedagogy as an educational tool. It's always been something that has involved many other skills. You know, we have critical thinking in there, of course we've got the creative thinking in there, we've got teamwork often, and we've got collaboration as well. So that's something that isn't unfamiliar to us, obviously, in our classrooms and in our teaching approaches. And then that final area, critical thinking and analysis, of course, that's a really important process for our learners. And it's thinking about how we integrate those opportunities for critical thinking through our teaching. You know, through taking that active learning approach, we encourage our students to really integrate all that information and to really focus on understanding the problems and really begin to use that language as well of critical thinking. So the 4 skills that we've mentioned there, that of course were, you know, many of which have been identified by the World Economic Forum, they're all interrelated, and they're all very much part and parcel what a lot of you are already doing in your classrooms. So reflecting on how we can actually apply and implement 21st century skills in our teaching when learning no longer has to kind of be a one-size-fits-all almost, or perhaps even confined to the classroom. What does the latest research tell us? So there are a number of emerging techniques and approaches that pedagogues are are recognising as really contributing to that development of 21st century skills. And they've been drawn together on this slide. So this covers, as you can see, we've got those 5 key areas of those professional attributes. But it also draws on the importance of knowledge in those key areas of literacy, of numeracy, and the different fields of STEM as well. And that's then underpinned with these personal attributes that many, and the majority really of researchers are now saying are really necessary to fulfill living in life in the 21st century as well. So when we look at this, and we also see that we can see success in the 21st century is also defined now as knowing how to learn. We have metacognition as well that's now being recognised, that latest thinking that we're familiar with in education that's now being added to those frameworks as well. So taking all that into consideration, a really good starting point is to think that the most effective way to teach and prepare your students for the 21st century is to implement and to scale what we already know about effective teaching and learning. And it's going beyond that terminology that's used in the skill frameworks to the actual interpretation of the concepts. As we've seen on the previous slides, many of you are already using those skills such as active learning, critical thinking approaches. So it's about building and enhancing what we do well at the moment, certainly within our teaching practice. So just in these final few slides, I want to try to bring that all together and to kind of start to summarise what that means in practice. I mean, one of the things we talk about is not teaching those skills in isolation. They shouldn't be content neutral. And it's about thinking about how we're developing those through meaningful tasks, how we're presenting that opportunity for learners to solve those authentic, those real world problems, how they're able to interact with one another, but also how we're pushing our students deeper, not only in their knowledge, but also their thinking. And we're providing those opportunities so they can really flex their analytical skills and their critical thinking skills. And once we've decided what kind of skills they need to engage in those meaningful tasks, we also then need to think about the tools that are going to enable them to actually showcase or to develop them further as well. In thinking about the curriculum, reflecting on how your current curriculum or any future curriculum design that we look at provides opportunity to really embed and develop these skills is also a really good starting point as well. And of course, the curriculum, the way it's experienced by our students, has to keep pace with change, doesn't it? And it has to ensure that they've got those skills for life and they've got those skills for learning as well. We know that cross-disciplinary knowledge is important, and we know that when we're talking about 21st century, those skills are all closely interwoven in many, many ways. So this might mean looking at how the curriculum is organised, the time available, or the areas of study that we have so we can enable mastery to take place, or how students are able to make further connections between those skills and opportunities they have to actually practice and apply those skills as well. And then certainly with assessment, how are we applying assessment in our practice? Are we assessing what we want students to be able to do once they finish school? Are we assessing beyond the academic knowledge? And the truth is, we don't always know how to assess the skills that young students need to develop, certainly the 21st century skills. They're not so easily measured. But if we look at some of the suggestions on that slide, it's that whole process of thinking a lot more deeply about how we use assessment within the learning process to enable us to support identifying those opportunities to gain that deeper understanding of students' achievement. So what we've discussed in this session is that there's not a simple answer to teaching in the 21st century. There isn't a single recipe for educating young people with regard to 21st century skills, but it's important that we're really empowered as teachers and we recognise that value of developing that shared, but also that consistent language around what this involves, and also that we're confident to consider the what and how for students in your own unique context as well. So just to finish, I just want to signpost a couple of things that might be helpful for you and schools in your journey towards developing 21st century teaching. We've got the Cambridge attributes, which of course are a great starting point in thinking about how you're recognising your students are developing those attitudes and those life skills, as well as their academic skills to be successful at university and beyond. You've got the education briefs and the getting started guides. And of course, you've got the new Cambridge primary and lower secondary guides that provide some great advice and guidance around different teaching approaches. We've got an example here from Cambridge University Press from Global English. And again, some really great support for through the project aspect of this. Projects, of course, are great for learners being able to develop and to have opportunity to do tasks which enable them to develop a deeper understanding, to connect those different 21st century skills, and then, of course, being able to showcase them as a way to do that as well. And then finally, Cambridge University Press have also developed the Cambridge Framework of Life Competencies to show what the different life skills there are and how they can develop along a learning journey. And they're based on a review of research, and they help teachers understand how those different approaches come together and they relate to the English language programme. And they give teachers some really good support as we know what is a challenging area. So thank you. I do hope that today's session has been thought-provoking. It certainly enabled us to reflect that 21st century teaching, it's flexible, it's creative, it's challenging, but it's also, it is complex. But in thinking about what this means for you and your school, it's really important to recognise what you already do well, in addition to considering some of those exciting new possibilities. So I'll hand you back to Steve, and we'll see if we have any Q&A, Steve, that are arising.
Thanks, Sharon. That was a really, really interesting, engaging session. Yeah, there's a few questions that come up in the Q&A box. The first one is, there's a question around, if we're trying to apply these 21st century teaching methods, does that mean in time teachers will have to move away from their old teaching methods, or is it something that can be integrated into their current practice?
Well, I think that's a great question, Steve. And I think it is about integration at this stage, because we already have some great approaches. We have some great pedagogy in our schools that is making a huge difference for our learners, whatever our context and wherever we are in the world. And I think when we start to think about those 21st century skills, sometimes it's actually really signposting that actually we will probably be using a lot of those already in our practice. So it's actually recognising what we do well. It's looking at the skills that we're already integrating and maybe making those more explicit. But then in doing so, looking at the ones that perhaps for our unique students, whether that's also come from national priorities and also from the global aspect, some highlighting maybe some areas. It may be that perhaps we're looking at resilience and thinking that might be something that we need to think about more within our future pedagogy. That might be a particular skill, or we may want to introduce more critical thinking as well. So quite often it's about, as we said, maybe around extending these and enhancing these, as opposed to completely kind of adding new things into practice.
That's great. Mentioning resilience there's a couple of questions that come up that touch on that. One of which is how, through all of this, mental health and well-being is mentioned a couple of times in some of the responses. And so there's a question here around how resilience is presented as a value within some primary schools and within the Cambridge Learner Attributes, and how we can help manage mental health and develop that resilience in students.
Yeah, absolutely. A great question again, isn't it? And I think for me, it's around that kind of often that ability to take risk in learning, and around that fear of failure, isn't it? That sometimes we can see even in quite young children that they're worried about making mistakes. And again, that comes back to our pedagogy. It comes back to that kind of climate that we create in our classroom, where we're encouraging learners to know that learning doesn't happen in a straight line. It's a messy process, and there will be those opportunities where they're going to come across something that they don't know what to do. And it's about that kind of where we might start to think, if we're finding that our learners are quite often have that fear of failure, then that might be perhaps demonstrating that it would be useful to look more at metacognition and look at what we're doing around teaching metacognitive strategies, thinking about how we're perhaps supporting learners to develop that greater self-awareness around that whole approach to their learning. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that does take time to embed, but quite often again it's looking at how these skills are interrelated to best support that and to develop that sense of resilience. And if we start this at a young age, we see it with our really young learners, preschool, don't we? They've got a great sense of resilience. They tend to go back, they tend to do. And when it comes to learning, sometimes our students start to step back a little bit as well. They're frightened of that fear of failure. So how we create the climate around that and how we do that throughout different subjects and across the curriculum is going to be absolutely key.
That's great, thank you. Had a couple of questions come in touching on the digital literacy IT skills portion of the whole skills framework, and how how that'll impact areas where there's low low access to digitization and technology.
And that is a real challenge, isn't it? And I think we've really seen that become part of a heightened awareness globally, haven't we, where we have got that digital divide. It's really shone a light on it, hasn't it, that, you know, some countries don't have that infrastructure that we have. They don't have that access to technology. Some students don't have it as a tool that they've been able to just switch to make that journey to remote learning. And in most instances, isn't there, as teachers, we're somewhat restricted by how much that can be a real barrier to how much, because we can't really influence that. We hope that obviously with policy may change, it may have created that sense of urgency in some places that things need to happen now on a much larger scale, so that, you know, students have those future opportunities. So I think as teachers, it's looking at where we can make the difference, because there may be some of these issues that are part of a much bigger picture and a much bigger sort of contextual and economic picture that aren't going to perhaps be able to change quickly, but there may well be some that we're moving to a much more positive future towards that.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions come in, Sharon, sort of touching on parental expectations about the development of these skills and schools' ability to do it, and also around assessment. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about appropriate ways of assessing and reflecting the development of these skills in learners, both for teachers and possibly for parents.
Yeah, of course, and I think that's key for schools, isn't it? We always do have that sense of tension, because we want that academic success for our learners, but also we know that the value of that goes with how they use that knowledge, how they use that information as well. So a lot of it is about communication around engaging parents. It's talking about the value of those life skills as well. Most parents, I'm sure they recognise the value of their child being able to be a creative thinker, about them being able to, and I think just as we need to have those conversations in our schools about making some of these skills more explicit, and actually you're almost thinking about the rationales to why it's important we implement them more into our pedagogy or we enhance them further. It's also having that conversation with parents about why it's important for their learners, why it's important for their school. And of course, when we start talking about assessment, there is that aspect of academic assessment, but also we're seeing the value coming through now around, certainly, you know, with a lot of things that Cambridge do around global perspectives, and also through the projects in global English, around the value of those students' opportunities that they have to become much more actively engaged in these type of activities, where they're being able to bring all these skills together in a much broader context as well. And then obviously how teachers are then able to look at that to actually sort of see which areas of skill or what aspects of skill where they can best support students further in terms of developing that future thinking as well. So I think communication with parents is absolutely key here. It's having that same conversation with them as well.
Okay, thank you. And you briefly mentioned global perspectives there, Sharon. There's a couple of questions and comments come in around the global perspectives course and how useful it could be for delivering some of the learning around these skills. So I wondered if you had a view on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is the great thing is, you know, Cambridge Assessment International, Cambridge University Press, there is a great range of resources and things to support schools further on that journey as well. So it's having a look. If you're a Cambridge school, what's on the school support hub, finding out some more, talking to your local representative. If you're looking at resources, you know, with Cambridge University Press, again, looking at what the kind of the project type approach that they have, looking at the life skill competencies. Have a look at the websites. There is it's a really good starting point to start thinking about maybe what could best support you in that further journey.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Sharon. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for today. So we hope you really enjoyed the webinar. And from the comments coming through, it looks like it's been really interesting and engaging, which is fantastic. And thanks for all of your questions, and apologies if we didn't get around to answering yours. And thank you also to Sharon, obviously, for taking time to be with us today. As we said earlier, and it's been mentioned in the chat, we'll be uploading a recording of this session to YouTube, so you'll be able to revisit the webinar and share it with colleagues. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the day.